Tywin Lannister, Lord of Castle Rock, Warden of the West, and Hand of the King, is head of House Lannister, and at a few points in A Song of Ice and Fire, the head of the entire Seven Kingdoms. Tywin Lannister never wore a crown, but for years, Tywin served as Hand of the King under 3 different kings: Aerys the Mad King, Joffrey, and Tommen. Tywin led armies and decided who lived and died. He was the most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms, and everyone knew it. Tywin was king in all but name. Because of this dynamic, I believe it's fair to judge him as one. This video essay is about the book version of Tywin Lannister, but hopefully you'll see how the arguments similarly apply to his HBO counterpart. In this essay, I will analyze Tywin Lannister's reign as de facto king under his grandson, King Joffrey Baratheon, using the political philosophy of Niccolo Machiavelli as lens for evaluation. The reason that I'm doing this is because lectures about Tywin's immorality, about how terrible he was as a father or how evil the Red Wedding was, have been argued to death. We've all heard these arguments before, and they aren't particularly interesting at this point. By conventional moral standards, Tywin Lannister obviously fails, as both a king and a human being.
I always thought you were a stunted fool.
But that's why most of his supporters don't seriously rest their case on that foundation. Fans of Tywin Lannister largely don't believe in classical virtue at all. Instead, they believe in the ruthless secular pragmatism of an author like Machiavelli, even if they struggle in articulating that belief. Reciting metaphysical philosophy to them that they implicitly reject, the stoicism of Plato and Aristotle, gets us nowhere. Tywin Lannister himself famously asked, "Explain to me why it is more noble to kill 10,000 men in battle than a dozen at dinner." Most arguments in favor of Tywin don't rest on the claim that acts like the Red Wedding weren't evil, rather that they were necessary evils. The argument goes that sometimes when you're king, you have to do bad things, and in a sense, sacrifice your own morality for the sake of your kingdom. Through this worldview, it's easy to see why Tywin presents such an attractive figure. At a glance, Tywin seems to fit the Machiavellian narrative, the noble man who commits necessary evils to uphold the crown, unite what is fractured, and create a lasting peace. As Ned Stark comments in Ned 11 of Game of Thrones, Tywin Lannister was as much fox as lion, echoing the virtues of kingship that Machiavelli endorses. When young Joffrey threw tantrums, Tywin quietly put him in place and worked tirelessly to fix what his grandson had broken. He arranged a marriage with the Tyrells, former usurpers, to seal a ruthlessly pragmatic alliance and eliminate the threat posed by Stannis Baratheon. When Robb Stark continued to threaten the crown, Tywin arranged the Red Wedding to kill Robb and all of his enemies in one fell swoop. And when Joffrey was assassinated, Tywin ruthlessly took control of the next boy king, Tommen, as if nothing had happened, and used the opportunity to clean house of his son, Tyrion. This essay lays out why Tywin Lannister fails as a king even under the generously low standards of Niccolo Machiavelli. The heart of this argument rests on 3 core pillars. Tywin allowed himself to become hated. Tywin brought his own ruin by failing to recognize the Tyrells as a threat to his rule, and Tywin allowed his feelings to get in the way of power. Machiavelli would chastise all 3 of these as serious mistakes. This essay analyzes Tywin Lannister with zero regard for virtue or morality, taking an entirely secular and pragmatic view of his reign, evaluating it by the standards of Machiavelli, and concluding that Tywin is an ineffective, poor king. Machiavelli's chapter on fear and love is one of his most quoted and one of his most misread. Everyone remembers the central argument, that it is better to be feared than loved if you have to choose between the two. Far fewer remember the third leg of that argument, which is the most important part of it. It is better to be feared than loved if you can't be both, but you must never be hated. Fear is acceptable, love is preferable, but hatred is fatal. A king can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated. The moment he becomes hated, the calculus collapses entirely. He elaborates elsewhere that a king must, above all things, guard himself against being despised and hated, because hatred is the one condition that makes every other political problem unsolvable. A feared king commands loyalty. A hated king commands compliance only when the interests of his servants align. Not only does Machiavelli identify that hatred is the worst disaster, he also identifies the quickest and surest ways to become hated, which is to seize property or women. Machiavelli warns further that a prince ought to guard himself against being despised and hated, and generosity leads you to both, meaning that even seemingly virtuous behavior, if it depletes the treasury and forces taxation, generates the same hatred as open cruelty. The lesson is to manage your reputation with care. Although George R.R. Martin tried to write Tywin as both the lion and the fox, what he actually ended up writing was a king who was the lion with no fox, a king who is all strength and no wisdom, who inflicts cruelty without discipline. Machiavelli argues that cruelty isn't inherently self-defeating. The effectiveness of cruelty depends on whether it's used properly or improperly. Properly used evils are applied at one blow and are necessary to one's security, and that are not persisted in afterwards unless they can be turned to the advantage of the subjects. Improperly used evils are those that multiply with time. The difference between violent cruelty that is used badly and violent cruelty that is well used largely comes down to timing. Good cruelty is done at the beginning, all in one go, to neutralize threats quickly. Machiavelli says that you do all your cruelty at once and then pivot to relatively benevolent governance. Bad cruelty is done gradually and repeatedly over time, keeping the population in constant fear and resentment, making stable rule impossible. Machiavelli says that, quote, those who practice the first system are able to mitigate in some degree their rule, as Agathocles did. It is impossible for those who follow the other to maintain themselves. With this framework in mind, the most obvious example of bad cruelty from Tywin Lannister is the ravaging of the Riverlands. This strategic decision worked against Tywin's interests. It made the Riverlands hate him, and it did little to reduce their ability to wage war. And, as Machiavelli warns in his section about defending cities, it actually hardened their resolve against the Lannisters, achieving the opposite of the intended effect. What should have Tywin done instead? Machiavelli says that a usurper like Tywin Lannister should determine which necessary evils he needs to commit and then do them all at once, rather than spacing them out. A ruler who does otherwise will always have to be on their guard and can never rely on their subjects, nor their subjects rely on him. For injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that being tasted less, they offend less. Benefits ought to be given little by little, so that the flavor of them may last longer. Machiavelli says that cruelty is like medicine. You have to drink it, but it's unpleasant. When you drink bitter medicine, it's better to swallow it all in one go, as quickly as possible, so that the taste doesn't linger in your mouth any longer than it has to. Once you've swallowed, you can rinse out your mouth with something more pleasant, like benevolent governance. Tywin Lannister's cruelty against the Riverlands was not the well-used surgical strike that Machiavelli praises in Cesare Borgia. It was cruelty that was poorly used, unnecessary, and it made him hated. Machiavelli warns against the lion, who is all strength and no wisdom, who inflicts cruelty without discipline. Tywin violated Machiavelli's principles at almost every turn. His cruelties were not concentrated at the beginning of his reign to neutralize threats and establish order. They were chronic, public, and ongoing, an endless string of atrocities designed to keep the kingdom simmering in fear when what they really brought was resentment. The clearest illustration of this failure is Sir Gregor Clegane, the Mountain. The Mountain was a weapon of mass terror, infamous across the Seven Kingdoms for violating and murdering Elia Martell and her children. This is the type of atrocity that Machiavelli singles out as the most politically dangerous. Violations of family and property don't fade. They fester and are passed down. Machiavelli gives us the exact playbook for how a wise king should have handled the Gregor Clegane situation, through the example of Cesare Borgia and Ramiro d'Orco. When Cesare Borgia conquered the Romagna, he installed Ramiro d'Orco to restore order through fear and brutality. Once order was restored, Borgia realized that he was becoming hated because he had allowed Ramiro to commit atrocities against the people. To distance himself from the cruelty that he needed to secure his power, Cesare had Ramiro publicly executed and left the body in the square for all to see, sending two messages. One, that Cesare had never approved the cruelty, and two, that Cesare was the type of leader who would bring them justice. The key principle, as Machiavelli leaves it, is that a king should delegate his cruelty to others and take credit for mercy and justice himself. Tywin understood only half of this. He did delegate the cruelty to Gregor, but he missed the entire point of why you use a delegate in the first place. The delegate exists so that you can sacrifice him, so that when the people's hatred reaches a boiling point, you give them a body and walk away clean. Tywin kept Gregor in his open service, rewarded and unrebuked, which meant that every atrocity the Mountain committed was, in the eyes of the Seven Kingdoms, a Lannister atrocity, and the text makes this association very clear. Tywin Lannister likely thought that Gregor was kind of like a head on a spike, a warning of what he would do to his opponents, and was prioritizing the fear that he needed to establish his rule. But what he failed to consider is that he must not allow his pursuit of fear to blind him to the fact that he was becoming hated. This hatred led to his downfall. I think it might be helpful to go over what Machiavelli would have done in Tywin's shoes, both during the sack of King's Landing and the ravaging of the Riverlands. During the sack of King's Landing, he would have acted similarly. In secret, he'd order Gregor Clegane to commit brutal atrocities against the entire royal family. Then, once it became clear that Gregor had done these things, Machiavelli would have renounced Gregor entirely and thrown him to the wolves. He would have said, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe Gregor did these things, and all without my approval. I never would have sanctioned such a vile and lowly act. In fact, to punish him for this, I will personally deliver his head on a platter to Prince Doran Martell. Your Grace, King Robert, I'm so sorry that this has happened. I swear to you that I never would have ordered such a thing. Please grant my house the honor of executing this disgusting criminal." In terms of the Riverlands, Machiavelli wouldn't have ordered this at all, but if we suppose that he did, he would have dealt with the aftermath in a similar way. He would have released a public declaration that he didn't know Gregor had committed any of these crimes, and that Gregor Clegane had been found guilty of a plethora of crimes. He would have likely used the opportunity to launder a bunch of Lannister mistakes with Clegane, blaming him for all the bad things that he didn't actually do, but which needed a convenient scapegoat. And once all of this had been done, Machiavelli would have dragged Clegane into a public square in King's Landing and brutally executed him, issuing apologies to anyone who had been wronged by this terrible man who had so very clearly worked against Lannister interests, because, well, a virtuous man like Tywin would never order such a thing. But let's move on to the thing that everybody wants to talk about, the Red Wedding. Tywin's defenders cite the Red Wedding as his masterstroke, and in some respects it does look like the kind of move that Machiavelli would endorse. Machiavelli says that injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that being tasted less, they offend less. He praises the logic of gathering your enemies and eliminating them in a single blow, especially under false pretenses like a war council, a session of parliament, or a wedding. He even notes with approval that a rebellion breaking out can sometimes be in your interests because it reveals your enemies and gives you the opportunity to exterminate them permanently. On the surface, the Red Wedding fits the Machiavellian model because Tywin used false pretenses to gather Robb Stark and his bannermen and kill them all in a single evening. However, the surface is where the resemblance ends, and Machiavelli would make several serious objections. First, Tywin didn't collect all of his enemies. He collected one faction of his enemies. The Stark-Tully alliance was broken, but Robb's sisters still lived. Stannis Baratheon still lived. Many Riverlords still lived. The Freys appear to have kept a few Northerners alive, like Lord Greatjon Umber, and certain lords, like Wyman Manderly, who the reader knows is very bitter about the whole thing, weren't at the wedding at all. The underlying political conditions that made the rebellion possible, the fracturing loyalty to the Iron Throne, the festering resentment across the realm, were virtually untouched. A true Machiavellian purge eliminates the threat at its roots, rather than trimming branches. Second, and more importantly, Tywin repeated the same mistake that he made with Gregor. He left his instruments of terror in plain sight. Walder Frey and Roose Bolton were rewarded after the Red Wedding, becoming the living, breathing evidence of what the crown had done, and everyone in the entire world was able to read between the lines. Machiavelli tells us that Borgia's genius was theater. The bloody body in the square was a performance of justice, designed to redirect the people's horror away from Borgia and onto a dead man so that the king looked like a virtuous person. The Red Wedding achieves literally the opposite. It makes the king look like a sick and twisted tyrant who will stab you at the slightest opportunity. Although Machiavelli says that a king should indeed be this kind of underhanded person, he constantly emphasizes that the king should not allow himself to appear to be this kind of underhanded person. Tywin let Frey and Bolton walk around as trophies, which meant the Red Wedding remained a Lannister crime in the public imagination. By allowing them to flourish openly, Tywin pinned the atrocity not on a scapegoat, as Cesare Borgia did with Ramiro Dorco, but on the crown itself. The contrast is instructive. Borgia used Ramiro's public execution to tell the people that the cruelty was his, not mine. I've given you justice. Tywin did the opposite, essentially advertising his involvement and offering no relief. He allowed himself, perhaps by design, to have a cruel image, which fueled hatred and resentment against his reign. Another illustration of Tywin's hatred problem is with his children. Machiavelli warns that a king must guard against being hated above all else, and Tywin somehow manages to be hated by the three most powerful people in his immediate orbit, his children, who should be his natural allies, and whose loyalty should have been the easiest thing in the world to secure. All of Tywin's children hated him. Cersei resented him for a lifetime of being treated as a commodity rather than a person, sold to Robert Baratheon in a marriage that she hated and consulted on nothing thereafter. Jaime was a great swordsman who was reduced to a disappointment the moment that he forfeited his inheritance and joined the King's Guard. Tywin never forgave him for it, and Machiavelli would say that this is a mistake. Tyrion is the sharpest case, and the most Machiavellian in its ironies. Machiavelli identifies the seizure of women as one of the two fastest paths to hatred. If you were to ask Tyrion who his woman was, he would say that it was Tysha, his former wife, or Shae, his former lover. Tywin took both from him. In Tysha's case, I'd like to stay monetized, so let's not describe that one. But in Shae's case, she was found in Tywin's bedroom on the night that he was killed by Tyrion. Tywin either took Shae, Tyrion's woman, or allowed it to look like he had done so, and allowed this to stand uncorrected, which Machiavelli would treat as the same thing. Appearances are what matter. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, but few to come in touch with you. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are. Machiavelli doesn't care whether Tywin actually slept with Shae or intended to steal her. What matters is that Tyrion found her in his father's bed, and that image, that visceral violation, was the thing that made Tyrion finally snap and put a crossbow bolt in Tywin Lannister. This is Machiavelli's warning made literal. Machiavelli says that men more quickly forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony, and they never forget the theft of a woman they loved. Tywin had denied Tyrion Casterly Rock, stripped him of credit for the Blackwater, publicly humiliated him at every opportunity, and forced him to marry into a loveless union with Sansa Stark. Tyrion endured all of this. It was Tysha and Shae that finally broke him. Tywin Lannister was killed by the hatred he had cultivated in his own son, perhaps one of the most preventable deaths in the entire series, and a mistake which Machiavelli would have seen 1,000 miles away. The result of all of these combined cruelties was that Tywin was hated by the entire Seven Kingdoms, from the small folk terrorized by his soldiers to the great houses whose women he had taken and whose fortunes he had stolen, to his own children, whom he spent decades methodically crushing and abusing. Machiavelli tells us that a king who is feared but not hated is in a stable position. Machiavelli says that he can endure very well being feared while he is not hated. Tywin crossed that line at every opportunity, and never once offered the scapegoat that Machiavelli lays out. There was no performed act of mercy, no performance of virtue at all, no signal to the people that virtue lives in the crown rather than in spite of it. Tywin Lannister was neither feared nor loved. He was, in the end, hated by all, even his own son. and Machiavelli would say that this, above all else, was Tywin's ultimate source of ruin. Tywin Lannister fell into one of the worst political traps described by Machiavelli. Quote, "He who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined." After the death of Renly Baratheon, Tywin Lannister was in a strategically difficult position. He's in a war on two fronts, against the Starks and Tullys in the north and against Stannis in the south. When Stannis Baratheon threatened King's Landing, Tywin arranged a marriage alliance with House Tyrell and secured their armies for the Battle of the Blackwater. The move was, on the surface, an exemplary piece of realpolitik. It neutralized Stannis and saved the crown. But Machiavelli asks, at what cost? The Tyrells were not weak neighbors to be managed and kept dependent. They commanded the greatest army in Westeros, they owned the largest food reserves in Westeros, controlled the Reach, the most fertile and populous region in Westeros, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to switch sides when Renly served their interests better than Joffrey. Further to this point, the Tyrells are clear graspers, and had carried out 2 attempts to usurp the throne already. Let us not forget that the Tyrells were plotting to replace Cersei with Margaery Tyrell before Robert died, and nearly succeeded in this scheme before he was killed. And after Robert died, when that didn't work, they tried a second time by using Renly as their tool in order to put a Tyrell on the throne. Tywin provided a third opportunity by delivering Joffrey into Tyrell hands, whom they then killed in favor of their preferred candidate. And after all of the other Lannisters get conveniently killed or discredited by the end of A Dance with Dragons, the Tyrells have seized de facto power. Makes you think.
Can it be possible they know what they're doing?
The Tyrells were not loyal subordinates. They were a great power stronger than the Lannisters and rivaling the Linnets, and Tywin handed them legitimacy, proximity to the throne, and a marriage to the king himself. Now, Tywin's defenders are going to push back here. They'll point to his marriage schemes as evidence that he was managing the threat. He married Sansa to Tyrion to deny her to the Tyrells, as he explains in Tyrion 3 A Storm of Swords. And after Joffrey's death in Jaime 7 A Storm of Swords, he even floats the idea of marrying Jaime to Margaery to keep the crown out of Tyrell hands. And in Tyrion 3 A Storm of Swords, he seems to recognize the threat of the Tyrells stabbing him in the back. "I will not have the Rose and the direwolf in bed together," declared Lord Tywin. "We must forestall him." However, this is immediately undercut by the observation that he suggests accomplishing this by marrying Cersei to Willis Tyrell, the heir to Highgarden, unless she can suggest a better match, saying that, quote, "Our alliance with Highgarden was the sword that broke Stannis. It should be tempered and made stronger," which goes to show that Tywin doesn't recognize the kind of threat that the Tyrells present to his reign. He knows that they're scheming, but he thinks that he can fix his problems by marrying them even more, which is a fundamental misapprehension of just how much trouble he really is in. Later, at the Purple Wedding, the Tyrells take part in a plot to poison Joffrey, the king who they were supposed to marry. If a marriage to the king himself won't satisfy their ambition, then the idea that more marriages will fix his problem isn't founded in objective reality. However, even if you disagree with this part of my argument, diagnosing an illness is not the same as fixing it, and the timing of when you diagnose an illness matters enormously. Machiavelli says that prudent kings regard not only present troubles, but also future ones, for which they must prepare with every energy, because when foreseen, it is easy to remedy them. But if you wait until they approach, it becomes easy to detect but difficult to cure. Thus it happens in affairs of state, for when the evils that arise have been foreseen, they can be quickly redressed. But when, through not having been foreseen, they have been permitted to grow in a way that everyone can see them, there is no longer a remedy. Political problems are like illnesses. In the early stages, they're difficult to detect but easy to cure, while later they become obvious but much harder to fix. Tywin's marriage schemes were reactive rather than preventative. He was trying to make countermeasures after it was already too late. Margaery was already betrothed to Joffrey. The Tyrells were already embedded at court. The illness had progressed beyond the stage where it was easy to treat. Worse still, most of these measures were never actually executed. If you recognize a fatal disease too late and never convert to action, what you get is an autopsy, not foresight. The window for early intervention was wide open, and Tywin spent it making things worse. We can see the deeper problems in Tywin's thinking after the Blackwater, when he had the chance to define the terms of his relationship from a position of strength. Machiavelli warns about elevating your rivals using the story of King Louis XII's conquest of Italy, an analogy that I think we can apply to the Tyrells. Louis XII, King of France, was invited into Italy by the Venetians, who wanted his help in seizing Lombardy, which is a province of northern Italy. Once he got a foothold, nearly every minor ruler in Italy rushed to be his ally. He could have easily held Italy by protecting these smaller allies and keeping great powers of Venice and the Church balanced against each other. Instead, he helped Cesare Borgia, the Pope's illegitimate son, seize the Duchy of Romagna, weakening his allies and making his chief rival, the Church, stronger. Eventually, Louis had to march back to war just to stop the Church from taking over Tuscany. Now, King Louis had his reasons for giving up Romagna to the Pope. The main one was to avoid war. But Machiavelli says that avoiding war was only delaying the inevitable to France's disadvantage, because at that point in time, France had the upper hand in Italy. Then, France committed the same blunder again. He divided Naples with Spain rather than taking it alone, importing a foreign power of equal strength and creating a rival in Italy where none had existed before. Machiavelli says that France was the biggest power in Italy and didn't need a partner. By bringing in Spain, he gave ambitious troublemakers and his own disgruntled subjects a place to find support. Machiavelli doesn't judge kings for wanting to expand their territory a little bit. By all means, take what you can. But if you can't take something and you still try, then Machiavelli says you're an idiot. Machiavelli says that if Louis thought he could take Naples, then he should have taken it alone. And if he couldn't take it alone, then he never should have tried. Machiavelli says that France made a bad deal that created a rival for no good reason. He also says that France followed none of the rules for holding on to conquered territory and that they should have never allowed the Church to become so powerful. He destroyed the minor powers, he increased the strength of one of his rival great powers, he brought in a foreign power equal to his own strength. He didn't settle himself in the newly conquered territory to make it a bit easier to maintain power. He didn't establish colonies in the newly conquered territory, again to make it easier to maintain his power. And he took away the territories of Venice, taking away his only check and balance against the Church in Spain. After all of this came to pass, it should be no surprise that France was kicked out of Italy. The lesson is this. Machiavelli says that it is a political truth that he who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined. If you help someone else gain power, you're ruined, because you raised this person up by using either treachery or force. In both cases, the person who you raised up won't trust you in the future, because they know that you're the kind of man who's capable of using treachery or force to accomplish your goals. They'll know that you're ruthless and cutthroat, and who would ever trust a cutthroat? Tywin makes the same category of errors in the same compounding way. He's the cause of another becoming powerful, and he's completely blind to the threat that this poses. In Tyrion 1, A Storm of Swords, it's explained that the Tyrells have been gaining the love of the people through charity. Basically, the Tyrells have been bringing up carts of food and wine and are giving it out for free, which obviously goes well with the crowd. If Tywin Lannister was a wise king, he would recognize this for what it is. He doesn't recognize that the Tyrells are choosing love instead of fear to gain power because he can only understand fear. Machiavelli says that a king must actively manage his reputation and must be seen as virtuous and generous even when he isn't. The Tyrells had colonized that space, while Tywin left it open for them. The Tyrells were managing their image like Machiavelli, and Tywin has nothing to counter it with. He does nothing to stop this acquisition of power, nor make the people love him in his own way. He entirely neglects the people. Tywin is almost completely blind to the threat that this poses. With the continued ambition of the Tyrells established, we can see the compounding effect of Tywin's blunders almost in real time by reading Tyrion 3, A Storm of Swords. the war planning session after the Blackwater. Right off the bat, he lets Lord Mace Tyrell into his planning session along with the Tyrell puppets Redwyne and Rowan. Already a big mistake. Watch what Tywin does next. All his lords are demanding castles and villages and orphans, and Tywin goes ahead and disinherits all of these lords from their lands and their castles, giving them to more loyal subjects. As laid out in the quote, Highgarden reaps the richest harvest. He even cannibalizes Lord Alliser Florent, his own vassal, who backed Renly and then Stannis. Brightwater Keep are given to Sir Garland Tyrell, transforming him into a great lord in the blink of an eye. This means that the Tyrells become the direct lords over two of the greatest holdings in all of the Reach. And he gives more land to even more of the Tyrells' supporters. And he basically lets the Redwynes not pay any taxes for 30 years. Tywin is not merely elevating the Tyrells. He's building them a base of support at his own expense. Brightwater Keep to Garland Tyrell, land grants to Rowan, Tarly, Oakheart, Hightower. Every major vassal of House Tyrell is enriched in a single afternoon, each of them now more indebted to Tyrell patronage than to Lannister favor, while 30 years of wine taxes on red wines, revenue that the crown desperately needs, is given up freely. Mace Tyrell entered that room as a powerful ally. He left it as the dominant lord in Westeros. This is Louis XII handing the Romagna to the Pope. Machiavelli would criticize Tywin by saying, "You've made another man powerful, and you've done it at the cost of your own resources. You've done it to your own ruin." But it's even worse than that. There's a second Machiavellian principle being violated here at the same time, and it connects directly to the essay's first argument. Recall that Machiavelli identifies the seizure of property as one of the two surest paths to being hated. The lands being distributed in that council room aren't Tywin's to give. They're the forfeited estates of dead and attainted lords, stripped from their heirs and handed out to his favorites like candy. Tywin is generated hatred among every disinherited family in the south, while simultaneously generating gratitude exclusively for the Tyrells. He is, in a single afternoon, making the Tyrells loved and himself hated through the same transaction. Setting aside the land grants, Mace Tyrell shapes Lannister's strategy to advance Tyrell interests from inside the room, disguising it with mockery and empty flattery. The consequences become apparent immediately. Tywin tries to bring up Lysa Arryn, asking what to do about her, and Mace Tyrell just waves it aside, saying that women have no stomach for war. Let her be. She's not like to trouble us. Tyrion points out actually that she imprisoned him, and she refused to swear fealty to Joffrey as she was commanded to do. But Mace Tyrell basically says, "Tyrion, you suck, and you'd lose." And then Kevin Lannister says that, well, we have a lot of enemies right now, so if we can push this back to later, then let's just let Littlefinger see what he can do. The audience knows things that Tywin doesn't. We know that Littlefinger instructed Lysa Arryn to poison Jon Arryn, and to send a letter to Catelyn Stark blaming the Lannisters in Cat 2, A Game of Thrones. These were the sparks that lit the entire War of the Five Kings. She's the keystone of Littlefinger's long-running scheme. Moreover, as Tyrion points out, she actually did commit overt acts of treason by taking Tyrion prisoner and trying to kill him in a sham of justice, along with openly refusing fealty. Flying Machiavelli's illness metaphor, Lysa Arryn is a political cancer at the stage that it has to be removed to save the patient. Mace Tyrell, whose interests are perfectly served by leaving the Vale alone and keeping Lannister attention focused elsewhere, waves her away with a smile. Redwyne, notably his vassal and his cousin, agrees. And Kevin, Tywin's brother, who by Tyrion's observation, quote, never had a thought that Lord Tywin hadn't had first. The subtext here is that Tywin also thinks the same things as Kevin, defers to Littlefinger to handle it. Tywin allows a rival great lord to set his agenda. Lysa is a disease that might still be cured, and Tyrion is volunteering to do it. Instead, the council defers and the disease is left to spread. She becomes a larger problem the moment that Littlefinger marries her, larger still when he murders her, and catastrophic when Sansa Stark falls into his hands outside of Lannister reach. Every link in that chain of consequences was visible from the council room. Tyrion saw it, and was mocked for seeing it. Speaking of Littlefinger, the ascension of Littlefinger as Lord of Harrenhal and husband to Lysa Arryn, decided in this same chapter, is yet another major blunder. Watch what Tyrion says here. He has incredible insight into what's going on. Tyrion says, "I fear a trap. Littlefinger is subtle and ambitious. I do not trust him, nor should you. He sold you Ned Stark. He will sell us just as quick. A coin is as dangerous as a sword in the wrong hands. Littlefinger's gold is made from thin air with the snap of his fingers. Littlefinger is a liar." But again, he's dismissed by everybody in the room, including Sir Kevin Lannister, who shares the same thoughts as Tywin. Kevin says, "I would sooner have Peter Baelish ruling the Eyrie than any of Lady Lysa's other suitors. Jon Royce, Lynn Corbray, Horton Redfoot, these are dangerous men, each in his own way, and proud. Littlefinger may be clever, but he has neither high birth nor skill at arms. The Lords of the Vale will never accept such as their liege. And there is this. Lord Peter continues to demonstrate his loyalty. Only yesterday he brought us word of a Tyrell plot to spirit Sansa Stark off to Highgarden for a visit, and there marry her to Lord Mace's eldest son, Willis."
Madness. Madness and stupidity.
With the benefit of hindsight, it's pretty easy to see why this is a stupid idea. Machiavelli would call Kevin a fool and agree with Tyrion's analysis. Kevin's argument in favor of Littlefinger is, at best, spurious. It sounds prudent and is instead ruinous. The idea that the Vale will never accept him because of his low birth and no sword skills is the logic of a narrow-minded man who can only think one move ahead, while a grandmaster like Littlefinger is already 20 moves ahead and thinking about his endgame. Kevin Lannister isn't the kind of competent mastermind that Varys' monologue makes him out to be at the end of A Dance with Dragons. In this council scene, we can clearly see that Kevin is a useful idiot, giving Tywin a spurious rationalization for a decision that he has already made with his emotions. Machiavelli warns that a self-interested advisor like Littlefinger can't be trusted because his loyalty is conditional on his interests aligning with yours, and they won't always align. Littlefinger has already demonstrated this to Tywin. He sold Ned Stark, he plays factions against each other, and his entire career is built on selling access to whoever benefits him. Tywin appoints him anyway, because of a sense of obligation for Littlefinger's help with the Tyrells and his future help with Lysa Arryn. It's a decision born from sentiment and convenience. It's not strategic. Even worse is that Tywin is trying to use Littlefinger as a tool to balance out the threat of the Tyrells via Sansa and Lysa, which means that Tywin is relying on his most untrustworthy advisor to counterbalance his most dangerous rival. He's compounding one blunder with another. Littlefinger's interests will align with the Tyrells long before they align with the Lannisters, which is exactly what happens. What this chapter makes clear is that Tywin is an improviser rather than a strategist. He takes whatever alliance is available, enriches whoever asks the loudest, ignores whatever threat requires a real effort to address, and appoints whoever happens to be convenient. Machiavelli is unsparing about rulers who operate in this way. He writes that a king who relies on luck rather than his own virtue and foresight will flourish only as long as fortune favors him, and the moment that fortune turns, he will have built nothing capable of withstanding it. In this council room, fortune is already beginning to turn. The Tyrells are being handed the material foundations of a coup that will be carried out, intentionally or not, in the epilogue of A Dance with Dragons when Varys kills Kevin Lannister. Machiavelli would call Tywin's plans gambling. The stakes are the throne. Tywin Lannister is almost completely blind to the true scale of the threat posed by the Tyrells. When Margaery Tyrell married Joffrey, Tywin embedded them in royal power with every tool and incentive to further expand their influence. Machiavelli warns specifically against this. When you conquer a new territory or forge a major alliance, you have to stay the dominant power in the relationship, ensuring that weaker neighbors remain dependent on you rather than you growing dependent on them, or worse, them growing strong enough to threaten you. He says that the ancient Romans strengthened their rule by supporting weaker allied states without allowing them to become too powerful and stamping down on any that become too strong. Tywin treated the Tyrells as a solved problem the moment that they had showed up at the Blackwater, rather than an ongoing threat that needs to be managed and constrained. He gave them
basically an open path to seizing the crown and then largely ignored them, which is exactly the kind of thing that Machiavelli warns against. The king who fails to perceive dangers early when they're easy to cure will face them later when they're often fatal. Joffrey's assassination at his own wedding, a Tyrell operation by all reasonable interpretation, was the direct consequence of this negligence. The Tyrells had been given the means, the motive, and the opportunity, and Tywin had provided all three by refusing to treat them as the kind of threat that they really were. Machiavelli's warning that he who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined wasn't a metaphor for Tywin. It was a prophecy. When we put all of Machiavelli's advice together, what we get is the image of a king kind of like a Stoic king, except that while a Stoic sacrifices everything for justice and virtue, a Machiavellian king sacrifices everything for power. Everything, sentiment, pride, grief, personal preference, must be secondary to the demands of power. Tywin Lannister seems to have understood this principle intellectually, but violates it constantly in practice. The most consequential personal failure was his refusal to remarry after Joanna's death. To put it bluntly, this is strategically dumb. Tywin might have been in a more secure position if he was married and had more heirs to secure his dynasty. Just imagine if he had another son or daughter. A man of Tywin's stature and ambition had no shortage of options. If Tywin had remarried, he might not have found himself in such a difficult position after Ned Stark's execution, and he may have had other allies to draw upon. He's a total hypocrite when he gets mad at Jaime for not marrying Lysa Tully. He could have married her himself. He had been unmarried for years by that point. Seriously, what was stopping him from marrying Lysa? She ended up marrying Jon Arryn, who was even older than he was. What would the situation have looked like if he had married Lysa Tully when her hand was free? He might have tried to marry into many of the great houses, like the Starks, the Greyjoys, the Martells, or even the Tyrells themselves. His refusal to remarry was grounded in grief, and succumbing to grief is not a Machiavellian virtue. To Machiavelli, grief is an illusion. The only real thing is power. Moving on from his super mega ultra blunder of not getting remarried, Tywin's choice of advisors is another major blunder rooted in letting his feelings get in the way of power. After explaining through several chapters why image is so important to a king, Machiavelli devotes a chapter to the selection of counselors, arguing that the quality of a king's advisors reflects directly on the quality of the king himself. He says that a wise ruler should build a cabinet of skilled advisors, binding them to himself through shared reward and mutual dependency. How do you pick a good advisor? Well, Machiavelli says that there's three kinds of people. The geniuses, those who understand things by themselves; the wise, those who recognize good thinking when they see it; and the useless, those who can do neither. The point that Machiavelli makes is that a ruler doesn't need to be brilliant, only wise. A ruler doesn't need to be the smartest person in the room. He simply needs to be smart enough to identify and retain people smarter than himself. A ruler of modest intellect who builds a capable cabinet governs better than a brilliant ruler surrounded by flatterers. Tywin did what Machiavelli says is very foolish, deluding himself through his massive ego that he was a genius who needs no one's advice, and surrounded himself with mostly flatterers and yes-men. Grand Maester Pycelle is the most obvious example, a sycophant of the highest order, whose main ability was telling powerful people what they wanted to hear. Littlefinger and Varys, whatever their individual abilities, served their own interests first, and the crown's interest only when it aligned with their own. Machiavelli warns that the self-interested advisor can't be fully trusted because his loyalty is conditional on his interests aligning with yours, which will not always be the case. Tywin never grasped this, and it eventually killed him. Most damning of all is what Tywin did with Tyrion. I want to go back to the council scene in Tyrion 3: A Storm of Swords for one last irony. If we look at this scene again, Tyrion is the only person in the room conducting Machiavellian analysis. He identifies the Littlefinger problem from miles away. He correctly identifies the Lysa problem, offers a valid solution on how to deal with it, and volunteers to neutralize Lysa Arryn himself. He even identifies the Tyrells as a threat and the danger their base of support poses to the Lannister position. By every Machiavellian measure, he's the most valuable advisor in the room. He's honest, loyal to the regime's interests above his own, and willing to say what no one else wants to hear. but he's mocked and overruled at every turn by Mace Tyrell, by Cersei, and ultimately by Tywin himself. Machiavelli says that a wise king has to be smart enough to identify and retain people smarter than himself. Tyrion was, by any objective measure, one of the most capable political minds in the Lannister orbit. As Hand of the King during Tywin's absence, he managed the small council, saved Joffrey's life during the bread riots, prepared defenses of King's Landing, and forged the chain that delayed Stannis long enough for their relief force to win the Battle of the Blackwater, the victory that also saved Joffrey's life a second time, and which saved the Lannister dynasty. Tywin's response to these successes was to strip him of credit and honors, deny him Casterly Rock, and ultimately drive him to patricide. This is personal revulsion dressed up as strategy. Tywin's hatred of Tyrion, rooted in Tywin's vanity and his trauma from Joanna Lannister, cost him his most valuable asset, and his life. A king who discards his best advisor because he finds him personally distasteful has allowed his feelings to overrule his judgment, and a king whose judgment is subordinate to his feelings is not long for power. Machiavelli's framework demands more than blind loyalty. For Machiavelli, loyalty necessarily involves honesty as well. A king needs advisors who are honest and willing to tell him no. Loyalty includes honest criticism, when it's brought up in the right time and place. Flatterers, on the other hand, are universally dangerous. According to Machiavelli, Tywin should have honored, enriched, and shared burdens with Tyrion to create a sense of dependency. Instead, Tywin denied Tyrion honors at every chance he could, breaking the rational basis for loyalty. Anticipating a counterargument here, it might be said that from Tywin's perspective, Tyrion looks like a self-interested loose cannon, while someone like Kevan Lannister is loyal and productive. From Tywin's limited perspective, Tyrion looks disloyal, so it's not unreasonable to strip him of power. The argument goes that Tyrion disobeyed Tywin's orders by bringing Shae to King's Landing, striking Joffrey, and threatening Cersei and Tommen. Let's start by revisiting exactly what Tywin asked to do in Tyrion 9 A Game of Thrones. Even this condensed version of the quote is kind of long, so let's rephrase this into a short, clear list. 1. You will rule, meaning you are the top man and Cersei and Joffrey have to obey you, because you are the ruler. 2. The phrase taken in hand means that you must take charge of Joffrey as if you're his parent, especially to improve his behavior. That's what taken in hand means. 3. Kill the others on the small council if they're treasonous. And 4. Don't take Shae to court. Let's start with Shae. Tyrion didn't disobey his father here. He never presented Shae to court. And Alayaya, who Cersei is tricked into thinking is Tyrion's girl, also was never presented to court by Tyrion. Now, maybe he violated the spirit of the ask by deliberately worming around it and bringing Shae to King's Landing, but he didn't violate the letter of it, and he also achieved the ostensible purpose of the ask to maintain the family's reputation, so there's no damages here. But more importantly, the argument kind of misses the plot of the story. At the point in time when Cersei confronted Tyrion about Alayaya, the person who knew about this were very limited. Tyrion, Cersei, maybe Lancel and a King's Guard, varies probably. The point is that the damage was controlled, as long as it remained within this handful of people. Instead of keeping this quiet and minimizing the damage, Tywin's solution for protecting his family's reputation was to blow this up for the entire kingdom to see. It just doesn't make any sense. He parades her through the streets so that everybody knows that Tyrion is scum. Nobody knew about this incident at all until Tywin made it an entire spectacle. He's the source of his own embarrassment. In Machiavelli's view, if no one outside the room knows, then it didn't happen. Remember that reputation is everything to him. There's a popular proverb that asks, if a tree falls with no one to hear it, does it make a sound? Some people argue that it makes a sound. Others argue that it doesn't make a sound. But everyone agrees that the tree did fall. Machiavelli's answer would be to reject the premise entirely. Even though the tree physically fell, politically speaking, the tree didn't fall at all because no one heard it. The same logic applies to threats against Cersei and Tommen. Again, if no one heard it, then politically speaking, it never happened, and Tywin can keep the damage contained. He should have also recognized that Cersei was testing the boundaries of Tyrion's power, and that he was well within his rights to strike back with cruelty. In fact, Machiavelli would compliment Tyrion for this threat, because it was so effective at keeping her in line. He would say that Cersei had forced Tyrion into doing this by challenging him so directly. So, under a Machiavellian lens, this isn't a valid complaint at all. Finally, there's the slap of Joffrey, which is the most serious error. And I want to be clear that this is, in fact, an error. In Tyrion 9, A Clash of Kings, Tyrion gets caught in the bread riots, saves Joffrey's life by forcing him to leave for safety, and then when he returns to the Red Keep, he slaps Joffrey and chastises him for almost getting them all killed. Now, this is a mistake, but Machiavelli would point out how the slap wasn't public. It happened behind closed doors in the Red Keep during a riot, witnessed by some of the King's Guard and a handful of important people, but not the general public or the nobility. For Machiavelli, this matters enormously. The king's reputation is about what people believe, not what literally happens. If the slap isn't common knowledge, then it doesn't erode Joffrey's authority in the eyes of the realm, and therefore it's not necessarily the case that you have to execute Tyrion for doing it. Also, we have to keep in mind that this slap, from Tyrion's perspective, wasn't made in self-interest. It was made in the interest of the crown. Joffrey had allowed himself to become hated, and this slap from Tyrion is the one honest person in his court who is making it clear just how much danger he's in. That makes him immensely valuable. Finally, Tyrion is actually doing what Tywin asked. Remember that he asked Tyrion to basically act like Joffrey's father and improve his behavior. The way that Tywin raised Tyrion, the way that he got him to behave, was by beating him. So, tragically, Tyrion is raising Joffrey in the only way that he knows how. The only real order that Tyrion disobeyed was that he didn't kill others on the small council when he suspected them of treason, but I would hardly call that being a loose cannon, and his behavior was still loyal. So, returning back to the comparison with Kevan Lannister, my reply is that according to Machiavelli, as far as advisors are concerned, loyalty without honest pushback is useless. Tywin confuses discomfort with disloyalty. Kevin's shared worldview means that Kevan is always going to agree with him, and Tywin will never hear what he needs to hear if he's going to be successful. That his military position is poor, that leaving Jaime at Riverrun is a risk, that Lysa Arryn is a traitor, that the Tyrells are a threat, and that humiliating Tyrion serves no purpose other than to strengthen his enemies. Now, Machiavelli does warn against servants who think of their own interests, but Tyrion's loose cannon behavior is not self-interested disloyalty. It is reckless and often stupid, but it's mostly directed at protecting the regime. Machiavelli's test for loyalty is, does the servant think of his own interest more than yours? Does Tyrion think of his own interest more than Joffrey's or Tywin's? I think it's pretty clear that the answer is no. Tyrion risked his life for defending a city and a king who openly mocked and vilified him. What part of this is in Tyrion's interests? The reasonable move for Tywin would be to wait until you get to King's Landing and investigate this yourself, or else publicly honor Tyrion while privately restraining him, not going through these public humiliation rituals. Even if it were reasonable to suspect Tyrion of being a traitor, and this is really not a reasonable suspicion, but for the sake of argument, let's just indulge this for a second, Machiavelli warns against half measures. Machiavelli famously says that the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. Instead, Tywin publicly humiliates Tyrion, removes his power, and leaves him alive, the worst of all worlds. Tywin creates a brilliant, vengeful enemy with nothing left to lose. This is a blunder of the highest degree. If Tywin was going to burn Tyrion, then he should have been so brutal and done it with such finality that he would never seek revenge. Because if Tywin does do this to Tyrion, then he will make an enemy for life, which is exactly what happens. In the end, Tywin Lannister died on a privy, killed by the son he should have cherished, the instrument of a dynasty he had spent his life building and systematically undermining. By Machiavelli's standards, this was the inevitable consequence of a man who doesn't understand power. Both the Stoics and Machiavelli agree. Tywin was defeated by his arrogance and outsized ego. In conclusion, Tywin Lannister's case as king rests on the claim that he was a necessary evil, a hard man doing hard things for the good of the realm. This essay has tested that claim against the only standard that his defenders will implicitly accept, the ruthless pragmatism of a man like Niccolo Machiavelli. And even by that standard, where morality is irrelevant, Tywin is still a failure. Tywin's biggest mistake was that he allowed himself to become hated. He violated Machiavelli's most basic warning by carrying out cruel acts publicly and continuously rather than temporarily and early, and by refusing to scapegoat his instruments of terror as a wise ruler must. His second mistake was that he empowered the Tyrells without constraining them, handing a rival great power the keys to the castle and then acting surprised when they used them. And finally, he allowed decades of personal sentiment, grief, pride, contempt for his own children, to corrupt his judgment at every level, from his refusal to remarry to his construction of a small council built on flattery rather than merit. Machiavelli's prince is not a good man, but he is a disciplined one. Tywin Lannister, beneath his charm, his dark wit, and his cold exterior, was neither.